He laughed, swirling his amber brandy. Love, gentlemen, please. She is nothing but a walking bank vault. She's just a dowry to me. The cruel words echoed in the dimly lit corridor. He thought he was confessing to his closest friends, entirely unaware his new bride was standing right behind the heavy oak door. The grand marriage between the House of Fairchild and the Mercer family was, to the untrained eye, the social event of the London season, held beneath the vaulted ceilings of St. George's Hanover Square. The ceremony was a masterclass in aristocratic excess. White lilies cascaded down the aisles, a choir of 50 voices sang soaring hymns, and the guest list boasted half the House of Lords. Yet, beneath the veneer of silk and satin, it was nothing more than a cold, calculated transaction. Rosalind Mercer was the only daughter of a ruthless, spectacularly wealthy coal magnate from Newcastle. Her family had rivers of money, but no blue blood in their veins. They were new money, whispered about behind feathered fans by the old guard of high society. Winston Fairchild, the Duke of Rotherham, possessed an ancient title dating back to the Norman conquest, a sprawling, decaying, ancestral estate named Oakhaven, and a mountain of crippling debt left behind by his late father's disastrous investments in the South Sea trade. Winston needed money. Rosalind's father needed a coronet for his daughter. For Rosalind, however, the arrangement carried a fragile, desperate hope. She was 22, possessing a quiet, observant intelligence, and a heart that had secretly yearned for the handsome, brooding Duke since she first saw him riding through Hyde Park. She had read the society papers, knew of his family's financial ruin, but in her youthful naivety, she believed she could be his salvation. She believed that with patience, grace, and unwavering devotion, she could turn their transactional vows into a genuine, enduring partnership. The first month of their marriage brutally suffocated that hope. Winston was not cruel to her. Rather, he was profoundly, chillingly indifferent. He treated Rosalind not as a wife, but as a mildly inconvenient guest in his home. They shared a sprawling townhouse in Mayfair, yet they existed in entirely separate worlds. He took his meals at his gentleman's club, spent his afternoons riding with his aristocratic friends, and only ever spoke to her to inquire about the running of the household staff. The turning point, the moment the fragile glass of Rosalind's illusions shattered completely, occurred on a damp Tuesday evening in late November. A fierce storm had rolled off the Thames, battering the windows of the Mayfair residence with relentless rain. Rosalind had retired to her chambers early, but a bout of insomnia drove her downstairs. She wrapped a velvet shawl around her shoulders and padded softly down the grand, sweeping staircase, intending to retrieve a volume of poetry from the library. As she approached the ground floor, she noticed a sliver of warm, golden light spilling from beneath the doors of Winston's private study. The scent of expensive cigars and aged cognac wafted into the hallway. She hesitated. She knew Winston had hosted a private dinner for two of his oldest confidants, Lord Frederick Stanton and Viscount Wesley Graham. She had excused herself before the port was served, knowing the men preferred their private conversations. Rosalind reached out, her fingers brushing the brass handle of the door, intending to gently knock and bid them a final goodnight. Before her knuckles could tap the wood, Lord Frederick's loud, boisterous voice pierced the quiet of the corridor. I must say, Winston, you played a dangerous game holding out this long, but the Mercer fortune is a sight to behold. Your creditors were practically weeping with joy yesterday morning. A low, resonant chuckle followed. It was Winston. Rosalind froze, her hand hovering in the cold air. My father left me a sinking ship, Frederick, Winston replied, his tone smooth, utterly devoid of emotion. I merely did what was necessary to patch the hull. But what of the new Duchess? Viscount Wesley Graham chimed in, his voice laced with mocking pity. She seems terribly eager to please. Follows you with her eyes like a lost hound. Surely you must feel some obligation to play the doting husband. She isn't entirely dreadful to look at after all. There was a pause. Rosalind held her breath, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She pressed her ear closer to the heavy mahogany, silently pleading to a god she wasn't sure was listening. Please, she thought, Just say one kind word. Just one. The clinking of crystal glasses cut through the silence. Obligation? Winston scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. I gave her my name, Wesley. I gave her father the privilege of calling himself the father-in-law to a duke. That was the extent of the bargain. No warmth for the poor girl at all? Frederick teased. She is a merchant's daughter, Frederick. A necessity. Do not mistake a business transaction for a romance, Winston said, his voice dropping to a cool, factual register that cut deeper than any shout could have. Love? Gentlemen, please. She is nothing but a walking bank vault. She's just a dowry to me. The Mercer coal fortune keeping the Fairchild estate afloat. Nothing more. As soon as the accounts are fully settled, she is free to live in whichever wing of Oakhaven she chooses, so long as she stays out of my way. Outside the door, the world stopped spinning. Rosalind didn't gasp. She didn't cry out. The devastating absolute truth of his words bypassed her heart and struck her directly in her spine. The naive, hopeful girl who had descended the stairs minutes ago died on the Persian rug outside the study. She stood frozen for a long, agonizing minute. Her hands, which had been trembling, slowly curled into tight fists. The tears that had threatened to prick her eyes instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. Just a dowry. She backed away from the door, her footsteps entirely silent against the thick carpet. She retreated to the shadows of the staircase and ascended to her separate wing of the house. By the time she reached her bedroom, her posture had changed. Her spine was steel. Her chin was raised. Winston Fairchild wanted a walking bank vault. He was about to learn that vaults have heavy doors, complex locks, and keys that he did not possess. The transformation of the Duchess of Rotherham did not happen with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful throwing of vases. It happened in the absolute, terrifying quiet of a woman who has reclaimed her power. The next morning, Winston sat at the long mahogany dining table, casually flipping through the Times, expecting his wife to enter with her usual tentative smile, pouring his tea and asking timidly about his plans for the day. Instead, the dining room doors opened to reveal a woman he barely recognized. Rosalind wore a tailored riding habit of dark, unforgiving emerald green. Her hair, usually styled in soft, romantic curls, was pulled back into a severe, immaculate twist. Her expression was utterly unreadable, a perfect porcelain mask of aristocratic indifference. She did not look at him as she walked to her end of the long table. She did not offer a greeting. She simply sat down, snapped her fingers lightly, and signaled the footman for her coffee. Winston lowered his newspaper, his brows knitting in mild confusion. You are up early, madam. I thought you preferred to break your fast in your rooms. Rosalind took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee before meeting his gaze. Her eyes, which he had previously dismissed as a dull, unremarkable brown, now struck him as sharp and cold as obsidian. I have business in the city this morning, Your Grace, she replied. Her voice was perfectly measured, devoid of the breathless, eager tone she had used since their wedding day. I find myself suddenly very interested in the administration of my estate. Winston gave a dismissive wave of his hand. There is no need to trouble your pretty head with such matters. My steward, Mr. Harrison, is handling the transition of the Mercer funds into the Fairchild central accounts. Actually, Rosalind said, setting her cup down with a soft, final clink, he is not. Winston froze. I beg your pardon? I said, he is not, Rosalind repeated, offering a smile that did not reach her eyes. I sent a courier to Mr. Harrison an hour ago. He has been instructed to halt all transfers immediately. Winston stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. You have done what? Rosalind, do not be absurd. The debts must be paid. The creditors will be paid, she interrupted smoothly, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. But they will be paid directly by my solicitors, under my explicit instruction, and only after I have reviewed the ledgers. You see, Winston, I spent the early hours of the morning reviewing our marriage settlements. Winston stared at her, genuinely taken aback. The settlements had been drafted by her ruthless father, Lord Mercer. Winston had barely read them, signing the parchment hastily, blinded by the sheer number of zeros attached to her name. "My father," Rosalind continued, rising gracefully to her feet, "was an incredibly cautious man. He bought me a duke, yes, but he did not hand over the key to his empire without contingencies. The Mercer Trust requires the joint signature of both the Duke and the Duchess for any withdrawal exceeding £100. Until now, I have blindly signed whatever your steward placed in front of me." She stepped closer to him, her eyes locking onto his. "That courtesy ends today." "You forget your place, Rosalind," Winston warned, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "You are my wife." "I have not forgotten my place at all," she whispered, leaning in just close enough that he could smell the faint scent of jasmine in her hair. "I am a walking bank vault, Winston, and the vault is now closed." Before he could utter another word, she turned on her heel and glided out of the room, leaving the Duke of Rotherham standing alone in stunned silence. By noon, Rosalind was seated in the plush, leather-scented offices of Mr. Horace Bingham, the senior partner at her father's favored law firm in Chancery Lane. Mr. Bingham was a shrewd, sharp-eyed man who had watched Rosalind grow up. "Your Grace," Mr. Bingham said, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed the documents she had laid out before him. "You wish to invoke Clause 4B of the settlement? This effectively freezes the Duke's unrestricted access to your capital." "Exactly, Mr. Bingham," Rosalind said smoothly. "My husband's family has a documented history of severe financial mismanagement. As a dutiful wife, it is my responsibility to ensure my dowry is not squandered on card games at White's or imported thoroughbreds." Mr. Bingham allowed a rare, grim smile. "Your father would be immensely proud of you today, my dear." The fallout was swift and spectacular. 2 days later, Winston found himself at the epicenter of a humiliating public incident. He was at his gentleman's club in Pall Mall, seated at a card table with Lord Frederick and Viscount Wesley. Confident in his newly acquired wealth, Winston had run up a considerable debt over a game of baccarat. When he casually called for the club's secretary to bring a draft for him to sign, drawing on the Fairchild Central account, which was supposed to be newly flooded with Mercer money, the secretary returned with a pale face and a deeply apologetic bow. "I am terribly sorry, Your Grace," the secretary whispered, though loud enough for Frederick and Wesley to hear. "The bank has returned your draft. They state the account lacks the requisite funds, and that any further drafts require the countersignature of the Duchess." The silence at the table was deafening. Frederick coughed awkwardly into his fist, suddenly finding the wallpaper fascinating. Wesley stared at Winston with wide, shocked eyes. Winston's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. He snatched the voided draft from the silver tray, his knuckles turning white. His friend's previous mockery of his eager-to-please bride echoed mockingly in his own mind. She had embarrassed him. She had cut him off at the knees, in front of the very men he had boasted to. He left the club in a blinding rage, demanding his carriage take him immediately back to Mayfair. He stormed through the front doors of the townhouse, ignoring the startled greetings of the butler, and marched directly toward Rosalind's private sitting room. He threw the double doors open to find his wife serenely embroidering by the window, the afternoon sun catching the gold threads in her lap. "What is the meaning of this?" Winston roared, throwing the voided bank draft onto the small table beside her. Rosalind did not flinch. She slowly tied off a knot in her thread, snipped it with tiny silver scissors, and finally looked up at him. "The meaning is quite clear, Winston," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "If I am merely a dowry, then you will learn to respect the currency. You wanted my money? You will have to come to me, justify your expenses, and ask for it." Nicely. The game had fundamentally changed. The Duke, who thought he had purchased a submissive savior, suddenly realized he had married a woman who now held his entire world and his pride in the palm of her hand. The Duke of Rotherham did not surrender easily. For 3 days following the humiliating incident at the Pall Mall Club, a tense, suffocating Cold War settled over the Mayfair townhouse. Winston consulted his own team of solicitors, demanding they find a loophole in the Mercer settlement. They returned to him pale and trembling, confirming what he already feared. Rosalind's father, a man who had built a coal empire from dirt and soot, had hired the most ruthless legal minds in London. The trust was hermetically sealed. Unless Rosalind signed the drafts, Winston was effectively a penniless man, wearing a very expensive crown. The breaking point arrived on a gloomy Thursday morning. A heavy, wax-sealed envelope was delivered to Winston's study by a private courier. It was from Mr. Percival Rutherford, a notorious and unforgiving financier who operated out of Lombard Street. The letter was brutally brief. A promissory note for £8,000, incurred by Winston's late father, was due in full by the end of the week. If the debt was not settled, Rutherford threatened to seize Oakhaven's eastern farmlands. Winston stared at the parchment, a sickening dread pooling in his stomach. He could not lose Oakhaven. It was his blood, his legacy. He had no choice. He found Rosalind in the Grand Library. She was not embroidering today. Instead, the massive oak table was covered in ledgers, maps, and financial documents. She wore a simple day dress of slate blue, a smudge of ink staining her thumb as she scribbled notes into a leather-bound journal. Winston stood in the doorway, swallowing the jagged remnants of his pride. Rosalind. She did not look up from her writing. "Yes, Your Grace? I require your signature." He stepped into the room, tossing the Rutherford letter onto the table, directly over her open journal. "It is an old debt of my father's. The deadline is imminent. I need £8,000 transferred by tomorrow morning." Rosalind set her pen down with deliberate slowness. She picked up the letter, her eyes scanning the brutal terms. Silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. "No," she said simply. Winston's hands slammed onto the table, shaking the inkwell. "Do not play games with me, Rosalind. This is not a gambling debt or a frivolous expense. Rutherford will foreclose on the Oakhaven tenant farms. Dozens of families will be displaced. You have made your point about the money, but this involves my ancestral lands." "I am not playing a game, Winston," Rosalind replied, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. Her dark eyes were terrifyingly calm. "I said no because I will not authorize a payment to Percival Rutherford. He is a predator who preys on desperate aristocrats. And what would you have me do? Let him take the farms?" "I would have you sit down," she commanded, gesturing to the chair opposite her. Winston, stunned by her authoritative tone, slowly sank into the leather chair. Rosalind reached into a stack of documents and pulled out a thick, dust-covered ledger. "While you were sulking for the past 3 days, I requested the Fairchild estate records from Mr. Harrison. Your steward is incompetent, by the way. He has been paying 20% interest on this debt for 5 years. You have already paid Rutherford the principal twice over." Winston blinked, his anger momentarily derailed by confusion. "My father agreed to those terms. The law binds me to them." "The law binds you to the contract, yes, but it does not bind you to stupidity," Rosalind countered sharply. "I spent yesterday afternoon with Mr. Bingham. We cross-referenced Rutherford's lending licenses. He has been quietly operating outside the bounds of the Usury Acts. If this contract is taken to Chancery Court, Rutherford stands to lose not only the debt, but his license to operate." Winston leaned forward, staring at his wife as if seeing her for the very first time. The quiet, timid girl he thought he had married was entirely gone. In her place sat a brilliant, calculating strategist. "I have already drafted a letter to Mr. Rutherford from my solicitors," Rosalind continued smoothly, sliding a fresh piece of parchment across the table. "We are offering him £2,000 as a final, absolute settlement to close the account. If he refuses, we drag him into the light of the courts and expose his illegal interest rates." Winston read the letter. It was legally flawless, ruthlessly worded, and held a veiled threat that left no room for negotiation. It was the exact maneuver a seasoned cutthroat businessman would execute. You drafted this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I am a merchant's daughter, Winston, she said, echoing the very words he had used against her in secret. You required a walking bank vault. You failed to realize that vaults are designed to protect the assets inside them. Sign the bottom of the letter alongside my name. Rutherford will accept the 2,000, and the Oakhaven Farms will be secure. Winston picked up the quill. His hand trembled, not with rage, but with a sudden, overwhelming wave of awe. He signed his name with a heavy flourish. As he handed the letter back, their fingers brushed. Why are you doing this? He asked softly. You could have let me fail. You could have let the farms burn to punish me. Rosalind carefully folded the letter and pressed her signet ring into the hot wax. Because, despite what you may think of me, I honor my vows, she said, her voice devoid of affection but ringing with absolute integrity. I promise to protect the House of Fairchild, and I will do so, even from its own Duke. The Rutherford crisis was resolved exactly as Rosalind had predicted. The financier, terrified of public exposure and the wrath of the Mercer legal machine, eagerly accepted the £2,000 and dissolved the debt entirely. News of the settlement did not remain quiet. In the insular, whispering world of London's high society, rumors began to swirl. The old guard whispered that the new Duchess of Rotherham was not merely a wealthy ornament, but the iron hand steering the sinking Fairchild ship. A week later, the social season demanded their attendance at Lady Diana Belmont's annual masked ball. It was a glittering, chaotic affair, held in a ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with champagne. Rosalind descended the grand staircase wearing a gown of midnight blue silk, a delicate silver domino mask obscuring the upper half of her face. Winston walked rigidly beside her, dressed in severe black velvet. The physical distance between them was minimal, but the emotional chasm remained vast, complicated now by Winston's simmering, reluctant admiration. As they stepped onto the ballroom floor, the parting of the crowd was palpable. They are staring, Rosalind murmured, her lips barely moving as she accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray. They are vultures, Winston replied quietly. They smell a shift in power. Do not let them intimidate you. I survived a childhood in the Newcastle shipyards, Your Grace. A few stares from minor nobility will hardly break my constitution. Before Winston could respond, Viscount Wesley Graham detached himself from a group of revelers and swaggered toward them. He was heavily intoxicated, his silk mask pushed up to his forehead. Winston! And the formidable Duchess, Wesley sneered, executing a mocking, overly elaborate bow. I must say, Rotherham, you are looking quite well kept these days. Tell me, does she give you a weekly allowance for your cigars, or must you beg for every shilling? A few nearby guests fell silent, turning their heads to watch the confrontation. Rosalind stiffened, her grip on her champagne flute tightening until her knuckles turned white. She prepared to deliver a cutting remark, but to her shock, Winston stepped smoothly in front of her, shielding her from Wesley's view. You are drunk, Wesley, Winston said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low register. Oh, come now, we are all friends here, Wesley slurred, leaning in. We all know the truth of the arrangement. A pity she insists on wearing the trousers, but one must suffer for one's supper, eh? Winston did not shout. He did not cause a scene. Instead, he moved with terrifying speed, his hand shooting out to grip Wesley by the lapels of his coat. He pulled the Viscount in close, his voice a lethal hiss that only Wesley and Rosalind could hear. If you ever speak of my wife with anything less than absolute reverence, I will drag you out to Hyde Park at dawn and put a bullet through your knee, Winston promised, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. And furthermore, Wesley, I have reviewed the estate ledgers. I know about the investments you convinced my father to make in your cousin's fraudulent shipping company. You are a parasite. Wesley's face drained of color. He stammered, pulling away from Winston's iron grip. and practically fled back into the crowd, muttering frantic apologies. Winston adjusted his cuffs, his breathing slightly elevated. He turned back to Rosalind, expecting to see a mask of indifference. Instead, she was looking at him with genuine astonishment. "You defended me," she said softly. "He insulted you. You are a Fairchild now. I will not have my house disrespected." Winston paused, his gaze softening as he looked down at her. "And he was wrong. You are not just a dowry. You saved Oakhaven this week. You saved my family's name." He held out his gloved hand. "Dance with me, Rosalind." She hesitated, her heart performing a treacherous flutter in her chest. She had guarded herself so carefully since that terrible night outside his study. But looking at him now, she saw a man waking up from a long, self-destructive sleep. She placed her hand in his. As he led her onto the floor, pulling her into the sweeping rhythm of a waltz, the world around them blurred into a whirl of silk and candlelight. "Winston," Rosalind whispered as they turned, her face inches from his. "What you said to Wesley about his cousin's shipping company, is that true? Did his family orchestrate your father's ruin?" Winston's jaw tightened. "Yes. I only discovered it 2 days ago, while reviewing the old ledgers you forced me to look at. My father didn't just lose the money through foolishness. He was actively defrauded by the men he considered his closest friends." A cold, thrilling sensation washed over Rosalind. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly locked together. The debts, the desperation, the cold detachment Winston used to shield himself, it all stemmed from a deep, catastrophic betrayal. She looked up into her husband's eyes, the obsidian coldness in her own gaze melting away, replaced by a fierce, brilliant fire. "How much did they take from him?" she asked. Winston looked surprised by the question. "Nearly 40,000 pounds over a decade." "Why?" A slow, dangerous smile curved on the lips of the Duchess of Rotherham. The merchant's daughter, the walking bank vault, had just found a new purpose. "Because, my dear husband," Rosalind murmured, her fingers tightening on his shoulder, "we are going to get every single penny back, and we are going to ruin them in the process." The winter that followed transformed the sprawling Mayfair townhouse from a gilded cage of silent estrangement into a formidable, clandestine war room. The heavy mahogany table in the library, once reserved for dusty volumes of Greek philosophy, was now permanently buried beneath maritime shipping manifests, bank drafts, and the sprawling ledgers of the London Stock Exchange. Winston Fairchild, a man who had spent his adult life aggressively ignoring the mechanics of money, found himself a devoted pupil to his own wife. They sat shoulder to shoulder late into the night, the glow of the oil lamps casting long, unified shadows against the walls. The physical distance that had defined their early marriage vanished, replaced by the thrilling, electric proximity of shared purpose. Rosalind's strategy was a masterpiece of mercantile ruthlessness. Through Mr. Bingham, she gained access to her late father's shadow network of financial informants, men who operated in the bustling aisles of Lloyd's of London and the discreet, velvet-lined parlors of Coutts and Co. "Bank, they are incredibly foolish, Winston," Rosalind murmured one evening in late December, tracing a slender finger down a column of numbers from a Baring Brothers account book. "Your friends, Lord Frederick and Viscount Wesley, possess titles, but they have the financial discipline of drunken sailors. They did not just defraud your father. They used his stolen capital to leverage their own extravagant debts." Winston leaned closer, the scent of her jasmine perfume wrapping around him. "Where is their vulnerability?" "Here," she said, tapping the ledger. "They are heavily invested in an indigo shipping venture in Bengal, but they do not own the ships. They lease them on credit, banking on a massive return next spring. Furthermore, Wesley's sprawling country estate in Kent is mortgaged to the hilt through a private consortium in Lombard Street." Winston's eyes darkened with a predator's focus. If that indigo shipment were delayed, or if the market suddenly flooded and the price dropped, they would default. We do not need to wait for the market to drop, Rosalind replied, a slow, dangerous smile curving her lips. I have instructed Mr. Bingham to use the Mercer Trust. We are quietly buying up every single promissory note, every mortgage, and every line of credit attached to Frederick Stanton and Wesley Graham. We are not going to sink their ships, Winston. We are going to become their sole creditors. Over the next 2 months, the trap was meticulously laid. Operating through an impenetrable labyrinth of proxy buyers and shell companies, Rosalind absorbed the debts of the 2 men who had mocked her outside the study door. Frederick and Wesley, oblivious to the invisible noose tightening around their necks, continued to gamble at White's and drink imported champagne, entirely unaware that the very ground beneath their feet was now owned by the coal merchant's daughter. The climax of their silent war arrived on a freezing evening in February. Winston had sent brief, urgent invitations to Frederick and Wesley, requesting their immediate presence at his Mayfair townhouse to discuss a highly lucrative investment opportunity. Driven by greed, the 2 men arrived promptly at 8 o'clock. The butler escorted them not to the grand drawing room, but to Winston's private study, the exact room where Rosalind's heart had been shattered months prior. Winston was standing by the fireplace, swirling amber liquid in a crystal snifter. The fire cast a warm, flickering glow over the leather armchairs, but the atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense. "Winston, my good man!" Frederick boomed, shedding his heavy fur-lined coat. "An urgent investment, you said? We came straight away. I assume the Mercer coffers are finally open for business?" "Sit down, Frederick." "You too, Wesley," Winston commanded. His voice held none of the casual warmth they were accustomed to. It was flat, cold, and echoing with authority. Wesley hesitated, glancing nervously at Frederick, before sinking into one of the wingback chairs. "Is something amiss, Rotherham?" "You look rather grave." Before Winston could answer, the heavy oak door opened. Rosalind glided into the room. She wore a gown of deep, commanding crimson, her posture immaculate. In her hands, she carried a thick, black leather portfolio. Frederick and Wesley immediately stood, offering polite, patronizing bows. "Your Grace," Wesley murmured, masking a sneer. "We were not expecting the Duchess to join us for men's business." "Please, gentlemen, remain seated," Rosalind instructed smoothly, walking directly to the center of the room. She did not sit. She stood behind the grand desk, the firelight catching the severe, intelligent gleam in her eyes. "This is precisely my business." She opened the black portfolio and produced a stack of thick, wax-sealed documents. She tossed them onto the desk. They hit the wood with a heavy, terrifying thud. "What is this?" Frederick asked, a sudden sliver of apprehension slicing through his bravado. "Those," Winston said, stepping up to stand perfectly aligned with his wife, "are your lives, Frederick?" "Over the past 8 weeks, my wife and I have systematically purchased every outstanding debt, mortgage, and promissory note bearing your signatures." Wesley let out a breathless, incredulous laugh. "That is impossible. My mortgages are held by the Lombard Consortium." "The Lombard Consortium sold them to a proxy firm last Tuesday," Rosalind clarified, her tone brisk and academic. "A firm entirely owned by the Mercer Trust. Furthermore, the Baring Brothers Bank surrendered your indigo leases to me this morning. You owe me £45,000, Wesley. Frederick, your debts total slightly over $38,000. The blood completely drained from both men's faces. The silence in the study was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. You cannot do this," Frederick stammered, his hands beginning to tremble violently. "We are your closest friends, Winston. We are peers of the realm." "You are thieves!" Winston roared, the explosive sound rattling the crystal glasses on the side table. "You bled my father dry. You orchestrated a fraudulent shipping company to steal from a man who trusted you. And then, you sat in this very room and mocked my wife." Wesley leaped to his feet, his eyes wild with panic. "Winston, please! If you call in these notes, I am ruined. I will lose the estate in Kent. I will be sent to Fleet Prison." "Then you had better begin packing your bags, Wesley," Rosalind said, her voice dropping to an icy, unforgiving whisper. "Because I am calling in every single note, effective by dawn tomorrow." "You vindictive, low-born," Frederick began to shout, lunging forward. Winston moved with lethal speed, crossing the space and gripping Frederick by the throat, slamming him back against the heavy bookshelf. "Do not speak to the Duchess of Rotherham," Winston snarled, his face inches from Frederick's terrified eyes. "You will leave this house. You will surrender your properties to my solicitors by noon tomorrow. If you attempt to flee, or if you utter a single word of this to the society papers, I will see you both hanged for the fraud you committed against my family. Now get out." Winston released him. Frederick stumbled, gasping for air, and scrambled toward the door. Wesley practically crawled out behind him, entirely broken. The heavy door slammed shut, plunging the corridor outside into silence. Inside the study, the heavy, suffocating weight of the past decade finally lifted from the room. Winston stood by the door, breathing heavily. He slowly turned to look at Rosalind. She was standing by the desk, the crimson silk of her gown leaping as she let out a long, shaky exhale. The iron facade she had worn for months finally softened. He crossed the room slowly, his eyes locked onto hers. He stopped, mere inches away, the towering, arrogant Duke reduced to a man entirely humbled by the woman before him. He sank down onto one knee. "Winston, what are you doing?" Rosalind gasped, stepping back in shock. He reached out and gently took both of her hands in his. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with a desperate, raw sincerity she had never seen before. "In this very room, months ago, I said things that were so profoundly cruel and blind that I have spent every waking hour since hating myself for them," Winston whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I called you a transaction. I said you were just a dowry." "I was a fool, Rosalind. A terrified, arrogant, bankrupt fool." Tears, long held at bay, finally spilled over Rosalind's eyelashes. She squeezed his hands, unable to speak. "You did not just save my estate," Winston continued, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to her knuckles. "You saved me. You tore down the rotting foundations of my life and built something real in its place. You are not my bank vault, Rosalind. You are my equal. You are my ruler. You are the only thing in this world that truly holds any value to me." He looked up, his gaze burning with absolute devotion. "I love you. I love your brilliant, terrifying mind. I love your ruthless heart. Please, tell me, it is not too late to be your husband." Rosalind looked down at the man kneeling before her. The ghosts of her naive, shattered hopes were gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable reality. She slowly dropped to her knees, bringing herself eye level with him on the Persian rug. She reached out, gently cradling his face in her hands, her thumbs wiping away the single tear that had escaped his eye. "It is not too late, Winston," she whispered softly, leaning in until her forehead rested against his. "The accounts are settled. The debt is paid. Now, we begin." He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a fierce, desperate passion that swept away the last remnants of the cold, transactional winter. Outside, the London rain began to fall against the glass, but inside the study, the fire burned brighter than ever, illuminating a partnership that neither high society nor history would ever forget. What an epic conclusion. Rosalind proved that a woman underestimated is the most dangerous force of all, turning a cruel marriage of convenience into an empire of love and revenge. Did you expect Winston to fall so hard for his brilliant Duchess? Let us know your favorite moment in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe for more thrilling historical dramas.